In the highlands of Papua New Guinea, there was a ritual so widely misunderstood by the outside world that when word of it finally reached global newspapers in the 1950s and 60s, most people assumed it was a form of violence. It wasn't. It was the opposite. It was grief, expressed the only way this particular culture knew how to express it, and it ended up teaching modern medicine one of the strangest lessons in the history of neuroscience. The ritual is called endocannibalism, the practice of consuming the flesh of a deceased member of your own community, not as an act of conquest or punishment, but as an act of mourning, respect and spiritual continuity. And the specific case we're covering today, practiced by the Fore people of the Eastern Highlands, didn't just get banned by colonial authorities decades ago. It also, without anyone realising it at the time, triggered one of the strangest epidemics ever recorded, a disease that could lie completely dormant inside a human body for up to 50 years before it killed you. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what this ritual was, why a culture would practice it at all, and how it accidentally led scientists to a discovery that changed our understanding of the human brain forever. You are a woman in a Fore village sometime in the early 20th century, and someone you love has just died. In your culture, death isn't something you distance yourself from. It's not handled by strangers, hidden behind closed doors, processed by people you'll never meet. When someone dies, especially someone close to you, mourning is physical, immediate, and communal. And one part of that mourning, practiced specifically by the women and children of your community, involves the ritual consumption of parts of the deceased's body, an act your people understand not as something grotesque, but as an act of love, a way of keeping the person's spirit, their strength, their essence inside the family, rather than letting it disappear entirely into the ground. You did not invent this practice. Your mother did it for her mother. Her mother did it before her. To you, this is simply what respect for the dead looks like, in the same way a funeral, a burial, a period of mourning clothing, or a memorial service looks like respect to someone raised in a completely different culture on the other side of the world. You are not doing something forbidden in your own eyes, you are doing something sacred. Think about how strange your own culture's customs would sound, described from the outside by someone who had never seen them before. Sealing a body inside a wooden box and lowering it into the ground, burning a body until nothing remains but ash, then keeping that ash on a shelf in your home. Every culture on Earth has developed its own specific, deeply felt answer to the same unbearable question. What do you do with the person you loved once they're gone? Your answer, the one passed down to you by every woman in your family before you, is this one. You don't think of it as unusual. You think of it as simply how you say goodbye. The men of your village have a different role in these rites. It is the women, mothers, sisters, daughters, who prepare the deceased and who take part in this specific portion of the mourning. Children are present too, raised inside this practice the same way children anywhere are raised inside whatever their culture considers normal and sacred. Nobody here is thinking about disease. Nobody has any reason to. The concept doesn't exist in your world yet, not in any form that would let you connect this act of love to anything dangerous at all. What you don't know, what nobody in your village could possibly know, because the science required to understand it wouldn't exist for another several decades, is that this act of love is about to become one of the deadliest customs ever documented by modern medicine. Not because of violence, and not because of anything spiritually wrong with the ritual itself, but because of something invisible, something with no name yet, waiting inside human brain tissue. Before we go further, it's worth being precise about what endocannibalism actually was among the Fore, because the popular imagination tends to picture something closer to violence or savagery, and the actual anthropological record paints a completely different picture. Anthropologists who studied Fore culture directly, most notably a physician and researcher named Carlton Gajdusek, working alongside local communities in the 1950s and 60s, documented that this practice was specifically an act of mortuary respect. The deceased's own relatives, primarily women, prepared and consumed parts of the body, including, significantly, brain tissue, as part of funeral rites. It wasn't randomly applied to enemies or outsiders. It was reserved specifically for people within the community who had already died of natural causes, treated with the same reverence a funeral in almost any culture treats a body. Practices like this aren't unique to Papua New Guinea. Anthropologists have documented forms of ritual, respectful cannibalism, distinct from wartime, or survival cannibalism in scattered cultures across history, including some documented practices among certain South American groups. Among the Wari people of the Brazilian Amazon, ethnographers recorded a related but distinct tradition in which the deceased's body was consumed not by blood relatives, but by the extended family through marriage, specifically to spare the closest relatives the pain of watching or physically undertaking the process themselves, a detail that overturns almost every assumption an outsider might carry into that word cannibalism. Far from being an act of disrespect, it was structured, in the Wari case, specifically to protect the grieving family from added trauma, while still ensuring the body did not simply decompose in the ground, which many of these cultures considered a cold, undignified, lonely end compared to being reincorporated into the community that loved the person most. The through line across these different, entirely unconnected cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years of independent cultural development, is almost always the same. This isn't about disrespecting the dead. It's frequently the single most intense expression of respect a culture has available to it, built on a belief that a body left to rot alone in the earth is a worse fate than being kept quite literally within the people who loved them. It's worth acknowledging there are several other candidates for forbidden ancient ritual that could have filled this entire video on their own, because the label tends to get attached to almost any tradition that looks unfamiliar or uncomfortable from the outside. There's trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole directly into a living person's skull, documented across dozens of prehistoric cultures worldwide, from ancient Peru to Neolithic Europe, sometimes performed to relieve pressure from head injuries, sometimes for reasons still debated, including possible spiritual or ritual purposes tied to releasing what some cultures believed were evil spirits trapped inside the skull. Remarkably, skeletal evidence shows many patients survived the procedure, sometimes multiple times, based on visible bone healing around the drilled openings. There's ritual scarification and deliberate body modification, practiced across parts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, sometimes serving as rites of passage marking the transition from childhood to adulthood, involving significant, deliberately inflicted pain as part of the ritual's meaning, the pain itself treated as an essential, non-negotiable part of the transformation being marked. And there's ritual fasting and isolation practices found in vision quest traditions among various indigenous cultures of North America, where young people were sent alone into remote wilderness for days without food, deliberately induced into altered mental states through hunger, exhaustion, and solitude in pursuit of a spiritual vision considered essential to their adult identity. Every one of these could be called forbidden by outside observers unfamiliar with their context. But we're focusing today's deep dive on Fore mortuary cannibalism specifically, because unlike the others, this is the one ritual where the consequences weren't just spiritually or socially significant. They were, unknown to anyone practicing it, literally, biologically lethal, in a way that would take modern science decades to even begin to explain. Here's where the story turns from anthropology into one of the strangest medical mysteries of the 20th century. Starting sometime in the early 1900s, and accelerating significantly by the 1950s, Fore communities began noticing a disease spreading through their population that didn't look like anything else. It typically started with unsteady walking, tremors, and slurred speech. It progressed to loss of coordination, uncontrollable shaking, and eventually complete loss of motor function. Victims would begin laughing uncontrollably at inappropriate moments in the later stages, a symptom so specific and so unsettling that outsiders who eventually heard about the disease nicknamed it insensitively but memorably the laughing sickness. Locally, it was called kuru, a word in the Fore language meaning to shiver or tremble. The disease was always fatal. Once symptoms began, death typically followed within a year, sometimes faster, and it was hitting a specific, disproportionate segment of the population, primarily women and children, with alarming frequency. In some Fore villages during the peak of the epidemic in the 1950s, kuru was killing so many women that some communities reported sex ratios among adults skewing dramatically, with far fewer women surviving to middle age than men. When outside researchers, including Gajdusek, arrived to investigate, they were dealing with a genuine medical mystery. This wasn't a known bacterial infection, it wasn't a known virus. Whatever was killing these people didn't behave like anything in the existing medical literature, and for years nobody could identify a clear cause. Gajdusek, a young American physician with a restless, obsessive curiosity, arrived in the Eastern Highlands in 1957 after hearing second-hand reports of the mysterious illness from an Australian medical officer working in the region. What he found unsettled him immediately. Entire families losing multiple women within a few years of each other, children showing the first tremors, then losing the ability to walk within months, then dying, often while remaining fully mentally aware of what was happening to their own bodies right up until the final stages. He set up a small research station in the Highlands, and over the following years, he did something most outside researchers at the time weren't doing. He stayed. He learned the local language enough to communicate directly. He built relationships with 4 families rather than simply extracting samples and leaving. That patience, unusual for the era, ended up being exactly what the mystery required, because the answer wasn't going to be found in a laboratory alone. It was going to be found by understanding how this community actually lived, mourned, and buried their dead. The pattern eventually became the key to solving the entire mystery, but it took years of careful, patient anthropological and medical work to get there. Researchers eventually connected the demographic pattern of kuru deaths directly to the demographic pattern of who participated in mortuary cannibalism. Among the 4, it was primarily women and children who consumed brain tissue during funeral rites, while adult men, who held different roles in the community, were far less likely to participate in that specific part of the ritual. The disease was overwhelmingly striking the same group of people who were most likely to have consumed infected tissue. That correlation alone wasn't scientific proof, but it pointed researchers towards something linked directly to the funerary practice itself. And when the underlying cause was finally identified years later, it turned out to be something almost nobody in medicine at the time believed was even biologically possible. Kuru broke that assumption completely. Years of research eventually identified the cause not as a virus or bacteria, but as a misfolded protein, later named a prion, capable of causing catastrophic, fatal damage to brain tissue without containing any genetic material at all. A prion doesn't reproduce the way a virus does. It works by contacting normal, healthy proteins in the brain and essentially convincing them to misfold into the same broken shape, triggering a chain reaction that spreads through brain tissue, riddling it with holes, giving the brain, under a microscope, a texture eerily similar to a sponge. This discovery, which eventually earned Carlton Gajdusek a Nobel Prize in 1976, and later earned a second Nobel Prize in 1997 for researcher Stanley Prusiner, who further identified and named the prion mechanism itself, fundamentally reshaped what medicine understood to be biologically possible. Before kuru, the idea that a misfolded protein alone, with no genetic material whatsoever, could cause a fatal, transmissible disease was considered close to impossible by most of the scientific community. The prevailing scientific consensus at the time held, as a near-absolute rule, that biological infection required genetic material of some kind, something capable of replicating itself using DNA or RNA. A protein, on its own, simply reshaping its structure and somehow spreading that reshaping to other proteins nearby, without any genetic code driving the process, sounded to most virologists and microbiologists of the era less like real science and more like something out of a horror story. Prusiner in particular faced years of open skepticism and outright hostility from parts of the scientific community after first proposing the prion hypothesis in the early 1980s, with some colleagues reportedly dismissing the idea outright, since it appeared to violate what was considered one of biology's most fundamental rules. It took years of additional research, replication, and mounting evidence before the concept gained the acceptance that eventually led to his Nobel Prize. Kuru proved the underlying mechanism could happen, and that discovery later became directly relevant to understanding other prion diseases, including Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, and, notably, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, the disease behind the mad cow crisis that devastated the British beef industry in the 1990s, along with its human variant, which affected people who had consumed contaminated beef products. In other words, a mourning ritual practiced by a small highland community in Papua New Guinea ended up giving modern science the key that unlocked an entirely new category of disease, one that continues to inform how researchers understand certain forms of dementia and neurodegeneration, even today. Here's the detail that made kuru especially frightening once researchers understood it fully. The incubation period, the time between exposure and the first appearance of symptoms, could be extraordinarily long. Some documented cases of kuru appeared in individuals decades after the practice of mortuary cannibalism had already stopped in their community, with incubation periods estimated in some cases at more than 40 and possibly up to 50 years. That meant a person could have participated in a funeral ritual as a child, carry the misfolded prion protein silently inside their brain tissue for essentially their entire early adult life with zero symptoms, zero warning, and zero way of knowing, and then, decades later, suddenly begin developing the same fatal tremors and loss of coordination that had killed people in their community when they were young. The disease had no test that could detect it early, no way to warn someone in advance, and by the time symptoms appeared, the underlying brain damage was already irreversible. This is part of why the last confirmed kuru deaths didn't occur until well into the 2000s, decades after the ritual itself had been discontinued following Australian colonial administration's ban on the practice in the late 1950s. The disease outlived the custom that caused it by generations, a slow-motion epidemic playing out entirely inside incubation periods nobody could see. Researchers tracking the tail end of the epidemic were, in effect, watching history play out in extreme slow motion. Every few years, a new case would appear in someone who had been a small child during the final years. Mortuary cannibalism was still practiced. Decades earlier, someone who had lived an entire ordinary adult life in the interim with no symptoms whatsoever, no reason to suspect anything was different about their brain than anyone else's. Then, seemingly without warning, the tremors would begin. This extended incubation period is actually one of the reasons kuru became such a valuable, if tragic, research subject for understanding prion diseases generally. It gave scientists a rare, if devastating window into exactly how long these misfolded proteins could sit dormant in human tissue before finally causing visible damage, data that later proved directly relevant to understanding the incubation timelines of other prion-related conditions, including variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, linked to the mad cow crisis decades later. The end of mortuary cannibalism among the Fore came from a combination of external pressure and internal recognition. Australian colonial authorities administering Papua New Guinea at the time formally prohibited the practice, partly influenced by outside horror at what was, at the time, poorly understood by the colonial administration itself. But it's also worth noting that Fore communities themselves, once researchers helped establish the connection between the ritual and the disease killing their women and children at alarming rates, largely abandoned the practice independently, motivated by their own understanding that something about it was causing devastating harm to their own people. That detail matters because it complicates the easy narrative of an outside government simply banning a primitive custom. The Fore were losing mothers, sisters, and daughters at rates that were reshaping the entire social structure of their communities, with some villages left with such a severe imbalance between adult men and women that it disrupted marriage patterns, child rearing, and the basic social fabric these communities depended on. Once the connection to their own funeral practices became clear, the motivation to stop wasn't purely external pressure. It was grief, compounding on grief, a community recognising that their way of honouring the dead had become, without anyone's knowledge or intention, a mechanism for creating more dead to honour. Imagine learning, after generations of believing you were protecting the spirit of someone you loved, that the same act was the reason you'd go on to lose so many others. It's worth stepping back and asking what forbidden actually means in the context of a ritual like this, because the word carries very different weight depending on who's using it. To colonial administrators arriving from thousands of miles away, mortuary cannibalism looked shocking, primitive, and worth banning outright, often with little effort spent understanding its actual cultural meaning within Fore society. To the Fore themselves, before the connection to kuru was understood, this wasn't forbidden at all. It was closer to the opposite, one of the most sacred, expected parts of proper mourning, something that would have felt disrespectful, even shameful, to skip. What actually made the practice stop wasn't moral judgment from outsiders, it was biology, an invisible, unintended consequence buried inside an act of love, discovered only because dedicated researchers took the culture seriously enough to investigate rather than simply condemn it. That's arguably the most important lesson buried inside this entire story. The rituals outsiders label forbidden or savage are, more often than not, deeply coherent within the belief systems that produced them, and understanding why a practice exists, rather than simply judging it from a distance, is usually the only way to actually explain the mystery underneath it. Today, the Fore people no longer practice mortuary cannibalism, and kuru has been effectively eliminated, with the last confirmed cases occurring in individuals who had been exposed decades earlier, before the ritual ended. But the scientific legacy of what happened in those highland villages continues to shape medical research into prion diseases worldwide, research directly relevant to conditions still affecting people today. There's something worth sitting with in the fact that one of the most significant discoveries in the history of neuroscience came not from a laboratory, but from a small community's ritual response to death, studied patiently and respectfully by researchers willing to spend years living among the people whose custom they were trying to understand. The Fore didn't set out to advance medical science, they set out to honour the people they'd lost, the same fundamental instinct behind funeral rites in every culture on Earth, expressed through a practice specific enough to their world to eventually teach the rest of the world something none of us knew about our own brains. It's also worth remembering just how recent all of this is. This isn't a story from some distant, unreachable past. Some of the last confirmed kuru deaths occurred within living memory, and researchers who worked directly with Fore communities during the height of the epidemic are, in some cases, still alive today, still able to describe what it was like to watch a mystery, this strange and this devastating unfold, in real time, with no textbook, no prior case study, and no existing scientific framework to fall back on. Everything they learned by being willing to actually listen to the community experiencing it, rather than simply arriving with assumptions already formed. That might be the most transferable lesson buried inside this entire story. Useful well beyond anthropology or medicine. The things that look most alien or most frightening from the outside are usually the things we've simply never taken the time to actually understand from the inside. Grief, it turns out, has taught human beings some of our strangest, most important lessons, sometimes in ways nobody could have predicted, and sometimes at a cost nobody could have foreseen either.